There are nights when the wind moves differently across the desert, when it carries something older than sand, older than the memory of water. On such nights, if you were to stand among the broken walls of Uruk or walk the silent mounds where Ur once stood, you might feel it. A weight in the air, a presence that has no name. The ancients who first carved marks into clay beneath these same stars may have felt it too. And perhaps that feeling, that sense of something vast and forgotten pressing against the edge of thought, was what compelled them to write. The oldest words we possess were not written to record harvests or count grain. They were written, it seems, to remember, to preserve something that was already fading when the stylus first pressed into wet clay. The Sumerian scribes, working by lamplight in the 3rd millennium before our era, inscribed lists that make no sense to us now, lists of kings who ruled for thousands of years, of cities that stood before the flood, of a time when the world was not as it is. These are not histories in any sense we would recognize. They are something else, something quieter. They are whispers carried forward from an age that may have ended long before Sumer itself began. What if those scribes were not inventing? What if they were transcribing, copying from older tablets, now lost, which themselves were copies of something older still? What if the Sumerian king list, with its impossible reigns and its cities built before the waters came, was not mythology at all, but a damaged record? A broken memory of a world that genuinely existed, then vanished so completely that only its echo remained? We stand now at a distance of more than 4,000 years from those first clay tablets. The Sumerians themselves are gone. Their language, undeciphered for millennia, was finally read again only in the last 2 centuries. And what those tablets told us, once we could read them, was this: that even the Sumerians looked backward into deep time and saw ruins. That even they, the first civilization we can name, believed they were not the first, that something had come before. The word they use was antediluvian, though that is our word, not theirs. They spoke of the time before the flood, and they did so with a specificity that troubles the comfortable narratives of history. They named cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shurupak. 5 cities, they said, existed before the Great Deluge. And in those cities, kings ruled not for decades, but for tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, they recorded, reigned for 28,800 years. Alalningar, who followed him, ruled for 36,000. These numbers mean nothing to us. They cannot mean anything. And yet they were written down with the same care, the same precision, as the grain inventories and tax records we do believe. Perhaps the numbers are symbolic. Perhaps they represent something we no longer understand, dynasties rather than individuals, epochs rather than lifetimes. Or perhaps they are simply what they claim to be, a memory so old and so distorted by time that only its shape remains, not its accuracy. A memory of a civilization that endured far longer than we think possible, in a world we can barely imagine. The scribes who recorded these things did not do so carelessly. The Sumerians were meticulous. They were accountants, astronomers, architects. They built the first cities, developed the first writing, codified the first laws. They were not primitive. They were not superstitious in the way we imagine ancient peoples to be. And yet they insisted, in their most sacred texts, that they were inheritors, not originators. That the knowledge they possessed, the knowledge of irrigation and mathematics, of the movements of stars and the cycles of the moon, had been given to them, taught to them. By whom? they did not always say. But the answer, when it appears, is always the same by those who came before the flood. Eridu holds a particular place in these memories. It was, the Sumerians believed, the first city ever built. Not the first Sumerian city, but the first city of all, anywhere, at any time. A place so ancient that even its ruins were ancient when the first temples of Ur were raised. Excavations there in the 20th century of our own era revealed something unexpected. Beneath the Sumerian levels, beneath the earliest pottery and the first mud brick foundations, there was a layer of silt, clean, water-laid sediment, meters thick in places, separating the Sumerian city from something older still. Beneath that silt, construction continued older walls, older floors, built in a style that predated anything the Sumerians made. The archaeologists who found this called it evidence of a flood, a local inundation, perhaps, or a seasonal overflow of the Euphrates. But the Sumerians themselves had already told us there was a flood. They had written it into their king lists, their myths, their liturgies. They had described it as the event that divided all of time, the world before and the world after. And they had been clear about one thing: what came before was greater than what came after. There is a text, fragmented and incomplete, that survives from the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh, copied from earlier Babylonian sources, which themselves were copied from Sumerian originals, now lost. It is called the Eridu Genesis, and it tells of the creation of humanity, the founding of the first cities, and the coming of the flood. But it begins earlier than that. It begins with a time when the gods, or beings the Sumerians remembered as gods, walked openly among men, when kingship, as they called it, descended from heaven, when the world was organized, ordered, made functional by intelligences that were not human, though they worked closely with humanity. These were not the vengeful gods of later traditions. They were not distant, unknowable forces. They were described as teachers, as planners, as ones who came, established order, and then at some point that is never clearly explained, withdrew. The texts do not say they died. They do not say they were defeated. They say only that they went away, that the world was left to humanity, and that humanity, for a time, continued what had been begun, until the flood came, until the waters rose and covered everything, and the world that had been was washed away. What remains after that, in the Sumerian telling, is survival. A handful of people, warned in advance, preserved in a great vessel while the waters destroyed everything else. When the floods receded, they emerged into a world scoured clean. The cities were gone. The knowledge was fractured. What had been continuous was now broken into pieces, and those pieces had to be gathered, remembered, reassembled as best they could be. The Sumerians, in this view, were not the beginning. They were the recovery, the second attempt, the descendants of those who remembered just enough to start again. And yet, even in that recovery, something was preserved. The ziggurats they built were not temples in the way we understand temples. They were platforms, artificial mountains raised from the floodplain, lifting the sacred spaces above the level where water could reach. Each one was built atop the ruins of an earlier structure, and those earlier structures were built atop older ones still, descending down through layers of time until the foundations disappeared into the earth itself. It was as if they were reaching backward, rebuilding something that had been lost, trying to reconnect with what came before. The god they associated with Eridu was Enki, the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of the deep. He was said to dwell in the Abzu, the primordial ocean beneath the earth, a place of infinite knowledge and generative power. But Enki was also described as a teacher, a craftsman, a giver of gifts. He taught humanity the arts of civilization, writing, building, agriculture, the making of tools. He was not a creator god in the highest sense. Others held that role, but he was the one who shaped humanity into something capable of civilization. And the texts are clear. He did this before the flood, before Sumer, in the world that was. The memory of Enki, then, may be the memory of something real, not a god, but a civilization. A people who came before, who possessed knowledge, who taught what they knew, and who were lost when the world changed. The Sumerians, recording these traditions 3,000 years before our time, may have been doing exactly what they claimed, writing down what had been passed to them, preserving a memory that was already ancient when they first heard it. We do not know what to do with this. Our timelines do not allow for it. Our models of history require that civilization began recently within the last 6,000 years in the river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt, when agriculture made settled life possible and settled life made cities inevitable. Before that, we are told, there were only hunters and gatherers moving across the landscape in small bands, leaving behind little but stone tools and bones. There is no room in this accounting for the world the Sumerians described. No room for cities before the flood, for kings who ruled for millennia, for knowledge passed down from an age we cannot name. And yet the Sumerians wrote it down. They preserved it through the rise and fall of empires, through conquest and fire and the slow erosion of time. They believed it mattered. They believed it was true. Not in the way a myth is true as a story that explains the world, but in the way a memory is true, imperfectly, incompletely, but true nonetheless. The question, then, is not whether the Sumerians were correct in every detail, the vast spans of years, the reigns of impossible length, the beings who came from elsewhere and taught what they knew. The question is whether they were remembering something, whether, beneath the distortion of time and the failure of memory, there was an actual world, an actual people, an actual collapse, so total that when humanity rebuilt, it rebuilt almost from nothing, carrying forward only fragments, stories, techniques, half-understood rituals from what had been lost. Consider what a true collapse would mean. Not the fall of a city or the defeat of a kingdom, but the erasure of an entire world system. Imagine a civilization that had spread across regions we now think were empty coastlines, now drowned beneath risen seas, river valleys, buried under meters of sediment, plains that became deserts or jungles that swallowed stone. Imagine that this civilization, whatever it was, depended on conditions that changed. Perhaps the climate shifted. Perhaps the waters rose or fell in ways that made their cities untenable. Perhaps there was catastrophe, earthquake, flood, volcanic winter, or perhaps there was simply time and the slow grinding down of all things beneath its weight. In such a collapse, what survives? Not the great works, not the libraries or the monuments or the carefully organized records. Those are the first to go, because they require maintenance, and maintenance requires continuity, and continuity is precisely what breaks. What survives is what people carry, skills, stories, the memory of how things once were, and even those fade. Within a few generations, the stories become confused. The skills are simplified, adapted to new circumstances, or lost entirely if they are not immediately useful. Within a few centuries, The original world is no longer remembered as it was. It becomes myth. It becomes the time before, the age of the gods. The Sumerians may have been standing at exactly that distance from the collapse, far enough that the memory had mythologized, close enough that the memory still insisted on itself. Their texts describe beings called the Anunnaki, a word that has been translated in many ways. Those who from heaven to earth came, or princely offspring, or simply the great gods. These were not the only gods the Sumerians knew, but they were the oldest, the ones associated with the deepest past, with the founding of order, with the time before the flood. The Anunnaki were described as judges, as decision-makers, as ones who held counsel and determined fate. But they were also described as finite, as beings who could be defied, who made mistakes, who acted out of self-interest. They were not omnipotent. They were not eternal. They were powerful. Yes, vastly so, but they were also, in some essential way, limited, constrained by the same world that constrained humanity, even if they navigated it differently. In later Babylonian tradition, the Anunnaki faded. They became background figures, distant and less important than the younger gods who took their place. It is as if, in the progression of myth, they represented an older stratum, something remembered from an earlier time that no longer fit the world as it had become. And perhaps that is exactly what they were. Not inventions of the Sumerian imagination, but inherited memories of an earlier people, a people who had lived in the world before the flood and who were remembered, imperfectly, as something more than human because the distance of time made them incomprehensible. There is a text known as the ERASED, preserved in old Babylonian copies from around 1800 BCE, but clearly deriving from earlier Sumerian sources. It tells the story of the flood, but it begins long before, thousands of years before, in a time when the gods themselves performed the labor of the world. They dug the rivers, they dredged the canals, they carried earth in baskets to build the banks that held back the waters. And this labor, the text says, became unbearable. The gods, these beings who were not quite what we mean by the word, grew weary. They rebelled. They refused to continue. And so a solution was devised. Humanity would be created to take over the work. Humanity would bear the burden, and the gods would be freed. This is usually read as mythology, as an explanation for why human life is difficult, why we labor and suffer and die. But what if it is also a memory? What if it describes, in the only language available, an actual transition, a moment when a more advanced people, whoever they were, created or elevated or trained a less advanced group to continue the work they had begun? The Mesopotamian floodplain does not organize itself. It is one of the most hostile environments in the world for agriculture: salty soil, unpredictable floods, searing heat. To make it livable required immense, sustained effort. Canals, dikes, irrigation systems that had to be maintained constantly or they would fail. If there had been an earlier people who established those systems, and if they left, for whatever reason, those systems would have needed inheritors. And the inheritors, looking back, might well have described the builders as gods, might well have said that the gods grew tired and gave the work to us. The flood itself, in these texts, is not random. It is not divine caprice. It is a response to a specific problem. Humanity has become too numerous, too loud. The noise rises to the heavens and disturbs the rest of the gods. And so they decide to wipe humanity away, to return the world to silence. But one among them, Enki, again warns a single man. Build a boat, he says. Save yourself, your family, the seeds of all living things. The flood is coming, and it will cover everything. And it does. For 7 days and 7 nights, the text says, the waters rise, the storm rages, the entire world is drowned. And when it ends, when the waters recede, the man who survived makes an offering, and the gods gather around it, famished, because they too have suffered. The old world is gone, the new world begins. This story is told not only by the Sumerians. It appears in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, where the survivor is called Utnapishtim. It appears in the Hebrew Bible, where he is called Noah. It appears in traditions scattered across the world: Greek, Hindu, Chinese, Native American, each with its own details, its own names, but each describing the same essential event. A time when the waters rose and destroyed everything, and only a few survived to carry forward what had been. The question we are left with is whether this is a memory of something that actually happened, or whether it is a story that humans naturally tell because floods are common and survival is rare, and the idea of starting over resonates across cultures. But the Sumerian version is different in one crucial way. It does not treat the flood as the beginning of history. It treats it as an interruption, as the event that separated one world from another. Before the flood, there were cities, kingship, order, knowledge. After the flood, those things had to be rebuilt, and they were rebuilt imperfectly by people who remembered only fragments of what had been. The Sumerian king list makes this explicit. It begins with the antediluvian kings, the ones who ruled for tens of thousands of years in the cities that existed before the waters came. Then it records the flood. Then it resumes, but everything is different. The kings now rule for shorter periods, still impossibly long by our standards, but no longer mythic. The cities are familiar ones, cities that we know existed. The world after the flood is the world the Sumerians lived in. The world before is something else, something they could no longer fully see, but which they insisted had been real. What would such a world have looked like? If we take the Sumerian text seriously, not as literal truth, but as distorted memory, what might they be pointing toward? Perhaps a civilization that developed in the wetter, warmer world that existed at the end of the last ice age before the Great Melt. Perhaps cities built along coastlines that are now underwater, drowned when the glaciers collapsed and the seas rose by more than 100 meters over the course of a few thousand years. Perhaps a people who had learned to work with water to channel it, store it, use it to make deserts bloom, and who taught those skills to others, to the ancestors of the Sumerians, before the rising waters forced them to abandon their own lands. Perhaps the flood the Sumerians remembered was not a single event, but a long process, centuries of rising seas, drowning coastlines, forcing populations inland, disrupting the networks that had connected one place to another. And perhaps, in the chaos of that disruption, the continuity was lost. The great cities were abandoned, the knowledge fragmented, and by the time stability returned, by the time new cities could be built in new places, the old world was no longer accessible. It was memory. It was myth. The Sumerians themselves built on top of older settlements. Everywhere they dug, they found earlier foundations. Eridu, Uruk, Ur. Beneath the Sumerian levels, there were layers that predated Sumerian culture, pottery styles that were different, architectural techniques that did not match. And beneath those, older layers still, descending down into periods we cannot name because they left no writing, no clear markers, only the physical evidence of occupation. Someone lived there. Someone built there. Someone organized labor and resources and created settlements that endured long enough to leave traces in the earth. But we do not know who they were. We do not know what they called themselves, or what they believed, or what they knew. We know only that they were there, and then they were not, and the Sumerians came after. It is possible that the Sumerians knew more than we do, that they had access to older records, older traditions, that have since been lost. That when they wrote of the antediluvian kings and the cities before the flood, they were summarizing something real, something passed down through the generations by people who had lived through the collapse and carried its memory forward. We cannot prove this. We can only notice that they insisted on it, that they treated it as fact, not fiction, that they built their entire chronology around it, dividing time into before and after, and placing themselves firmly in the after, as the inheritors of something they had not created. The deeper we move into the Sumerian records, the stranger they become. There are tablets that list not only kings, but a word that has no easy translation. It has been rendered as divine powers, or universal decrees, or simply the elements of civilization. But none of these quite captures what the Sumerians seem to mean. The Mes were something like blueprints, like the underlying principles that made civilization possible: kingship, priesthood, truth, metalworking, writing, music, law. The tablets say there were more than 100 of them, and they were not human inventions. They were given, transferred, held originally by the gods, particularly by Enki, in his temple at Eridu, and then distributed, sometimes stolen, sometimes granted, to the cities that would use them. This is mythology, certainly. But it is mythology that encodes something observable, that civilization does not arise spontaneously, that it depends on accumulated knowledge, on techniques passed from one generation to the next, on systems that must be learned. The Sumerians seem to understand this. They seem to know that what they had the ability to write, to calculate, to organize large groups of people toward common purpose was not natural. It was inherited, and they traced that inheritance backward, through time, to a source they could no longer fully identify, but which they remembered as the time before the flood, the age of the Anunnaki, the beginning that was not their own beginning. One tablet, fragmentary and difficult to read, describes Enki traveling among the early cities, bestowing the Mes upon each one, determining what each would be known for, what role each would play in the order of the world. To Eridu, he gave the foundations the primacy of being first, the connection to the deep waters of knowledge. To he gave commerce and law. To Uruk, he gave kingship and sacred power, and so on, city by city, each receiving its function, its place in a system that was larger than any individual settlement. This was not mythology in the sense of explaining nature. This was something else, a memory, perhaps, of an actual process of organization, of a time when the scattered communities of the floodplain were brought into relationship with one another, taught to specialize, to trade, to function as parts of a whole. And who would have done this? The Sumerians said the gods. But if we strip away that language, if we ask what kind of actual people might be remembered this way, we are left with a troubling possibility that there were predecessors. That before the Sumerians built their cities in the mud of southern Mesopotamia, someone else had already established patterns, already created systems, already mapped out the relationships between river and field, city and temple, king and god, and that the Sumerians, emerging into a world where those patterns still lingered in the ruins, in the old irrigation channels, in the stories told by those who had survived the collapse, simply continued them, adapted them, claimed them as their own, because there was no one left to say otherwise. There is a site in southeastern Turkey, far to the north of Sumer, that troubles our timelines in a different way. It is called Göbekli Tepe, and it was built more than 11,000 years ago, 7,000 years before the first Sumerian cities, in a time when humanity was not supposed to be capable of such things. It consists of massive stone pillars, carved with images of animals, arranged in circles, buried deliberately at some point in the distant past. It is clearly a sacred site, clearly the product of organized labor and sophisticated planning. And it predates agriculture. It predates settled life. It was built by people we would classify as hunter-gatherers, and yet they moved stones weighing many tons, carved them with precision, and created something that required the coordination of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of individuals over generations. Göbekli Tepe does not fit our models. It suggests that the story we tell ourselves, that civilization began with farming, that farming led to surplus, that surplus led to cities and writing, and all the rest is incomplete. It suggests that the capacity for organization, for monumental construction, for symbolic thought complex enough to create sacred architecture, existed long before we thought it did. And if it existed there, in one place, 11,000 years ago, why not elsewhere? Why not in places we have not yet found, or cannot find, because they are beneath the ocean or buried under sediment or erased so completely that no trace remains? The Sumerians did not know about Göbekli Tepe. They could not have. And yet they insisted that there had been cities before their cities, knowledge before their knowledge, a world before their world. Were they simply inventing this? Or were they, like us, looking at ruins they could not explain, listening to stories they could not verify, and trying to make sense of a past that was deeper and stranger than their present could easily accommodate? There is another layer to this. The Sumerian language itself is an isolate. It is not related to any other known language, living or dead. It stands alone. The people who spoke it appear in the archaeological records suddenly, already possessing writing, already building cities, already practicing complex religion. Where they came from, we do not know. The land they settled had been occupied before there is clear evidence of earlier cultures in the same region, but whether the Sumerians were descended from those earlier people, or whether they arrived from somewhere else and displaced or absorbed them, remains unclear. The Sumerians themselves did not claim to be indigenous. Their myths often describe a journey, a migration, a coming from elsewhere, but from where, they do not say. Only that they came, and that when they came, they brought knowledge with them. Or perhaps they found knowledge already there, waiting in the ruins, encoded in the landscape, carried forward by survivors who no longer understood what they remembered, but who remembered nonetheless. This is speculation, but it is speculation the evidence allows. The Sumerians built their temples on top of older foundations. They used older words in their religious vocabulary, words that do not fit the grammar of Sumerian and may belong to an earlier language entirely. They described their gods as beings who had lived among humans in a previous age, who had taught and organized and then withdrawn, leaving humanity to continue alone. All of this could be invention, or it could be memory, distorted by time but rooted in something real. Consider the technology the Sumerians possessed. They did not discover bronze, they inherited it. The metalworking techniques they used were already sophisticated when they appear in the record, suggesting a long prior development that happened elsewhere, or earlier, and was brought to Sumer fully formed. They did not invent the wheel. It appears in their culture suddenly, already in use for pottery and transport, with no clear predecessor. They did not develop writing gradually. The earliest tablets we have are already systematic, already using a complex array of signs that implies a significant period of prior evolution. And their mathematics, base 6-0 mathematics, the same system we still use for measuring time and angles, was not simple. It was elegant, efficient, capable of handling fractions and astronomical calculations with remarkable precision. Where did this come from? How did a people who had supposedly just transitioned from nomadic life to settled agriculture develop such refined systems so quickly? The conventional answer is that we simply have not found the earlier evidence, that there must have been centuries of development that left no trace, or whose traces were destroyed by the very floods the Sumerians remembered. This may be true, but it is also possible that the Sumerians were not starting from nothing, that they were rebuilding, that the knowledge they possessed was not entirely their own invention, but was, in part, recovered, remembered, pieced together from fragments of an older world that had collapsed but not vanished completely. The ziggurats speak to this. These stepped pyramids, built at the heart of every major Sumerian city, were not simply temples. They were reconstructions. Each one was built atop the ruins of an earlier ziggurat, and when the earlier structure decayed, it was filled in and a new one built on top, so that the sacred platform rose higher with each generation. Archaeologists excavating these sites have found, in some cases, more than a dozen layers, ziggurat built upon ziggurat, descending down through centuries, through dynasties, through the rise and fall of kingdoms, until the lowest levels are so old that they predate Sumerian civilization itself, and yet the form remains the same, the function remains the same, as if they were not inventing, but maintaining, as if they were trying, generation after generation, to preserve something that had been given to them, to keep the connection alive, even as the original meaning faded. At the top of each ziggurat was a temple, and in the temple was a chamber where the god of the city was said to dwell. But the god was never depicted there. The chamber was empty, or nearly so, a bed, a table, offerings left by priests who tended the space as if someone might return. The rituals performed there were not prayers in the way we understand prayers. They were maintenance. They were the repetition of formulas, the performance of actions that had been prescribed long ago and were continued, because to stop would be to break the covenant, to sever the last thread connecting the present to the past. There is something profoundly sad in this, the sense that the Sumerians were waiting for something that would not come back, that they built and rebuilt generation after generation, maintaining a system that no longer had its original participants, performing rituals whose purpose they no longer fully understood, speaking to gods who no longer answered if they ever had. And yet they continued, because the memory insisted, because they believed, or needed to believe, that what had been might someday be again. The texts describe a moment near the end of the antediluvian period, when the gods gathered in council and made the decision to send the flood. The reasoning varies depending on the text. Sometimes humanity has grown too numerous, too noisy. Sometimes humanity has become corrupt, violent, unmanageable. Sometimes no reason is given at all. But the outcome is always the same. The decision is made. The flood will come. And one God always, Enki, the God of wisdom, the teacher breaks ranks. He warns a human. He gives instructions. Build a vessel. Save what can be saved. The deluge is coming, and only those who prepare will survive. This moment, this act of defiance or compassion, is central to the Sumerian understanding of their own existence. They are the descendants of the warned, the saved, the ones who were permitted to continue. But they are also the abandoned. The gods did not come back. They did not rebuild the cities themselves. They left that to humanity. And humanity did rebuild, but incompletely, imperfectly, with only fragments of what had been. The Sumerians lived in that incompleteness. They lived in the after, always aware that there had been a before, and that the before had been greater. The flood itself, as described in the texts, was not merely water. It was dissolution. The boundaries that had ordered the world between sky and earth, between fresh water and salt, between the cultivated and the wild, all collapsed. For 7 days and 7 nights, the tablets say, there was no distinction. Everything returned to chaos, to the primordial state before creation, before separation, before the world had been organized into the forms that made life possible. And when the waters receded, when the survivors emerged, they found themselves in a world that had been scoured. The cities were gone. The fields were buried under silt. The canals had vanished. The knowledge of how things had been done was fractured, scattered among the few who remained, and those few had to decide what to preserve, what to prioritize, what could be rebuilt with the resources and memory they had left. This is what survival looks like after total collapse. Not heroic renewal, but slow, painful reconstruction. The Sumerian king list records that after the flood, kingship descended from heaven once again. But the kings who ruled in this new age were different. Their reigns, though still impossibly long by our measure, were shorter than those who came before. The cities they ruled were smaller, more fragile. The texts describe them struggling against drought, against invasion, against the chaos that always threatened to return. The before had been stable, enduring, ordered by the presence of those who knew how to maintain order. The after was precarious. Humanity was on its own, and the world was harder than it had been. What the Sumerians seem to have understood, with a clarity that disturbs our comfortable narratives, is that civilization is not inevitable, that it can end, that the knowledge and systems that sustain it can be lost, and that once lost, they are extraordinarily difficult to recover. They lived in the shadow of that loss. Every ziggurat they built, every canal they dug, every tablet they inscribed was an act of defiance against forgetting. They were trying to hold on to something, trying to maintain continuity with a past that was slipping further away with each generation. And yet, within their records, there are moments of astonishing specificity. Lists of stars and their movements, recorded with precision that matches modern astronomical observation. Mathematical tables that demonstrate understanding of complex relationships between numbers. Medical texts that describe symptoms and treatments with clinical detachment. Engineering knowledge encoded in the dimensions of their buildings, in the angles of their irrigation systems, in the materials they chose for different purposes. This was not primitive superstition. This was inherited science, practical, tested, refined over time. But refined by whom? By the Sumerians themselves, working it out through trial and error? Or by their predecessors, and the Sumerians merely preserved what they had been given? There is a text, fragmentary and enigmatic, that describes Enki organizing the world after the flood. He goes to each region, the marshlands, the mountains, the sea, and establishes its function, assigns it its role in the renewed order. But the language is strange. He does not create these places. He does not bring them into being. He fixes them. He restores them, as if they had existed before, had served these functions before, and were being returned to their proper state after the chaos of the deluge. This is the language of repair, not creation. The language of someone working from a template, trying to rebuild what had been lost. And the template itself, where did it come from? The Sumerians had words for different kinds of knowledge. There was knowledge that could be learned through experience, through practice, through observation. And there was knowledge that was simply known, that had always been known, that belonged to the Mez and had been given at the beginning. They did not claim to have invented their civilization. They claimed to have received it, to have been taught by the gods. Yes, but gods who acted as teachers who conveyed specific information, who expected that information to be used and maintained. Not distant, inscrutable divinities, but present, engaged beings who had a stake in humanity's success, because humanity was performing a function, continuing a work that the gods themselves had begun, and then, for reasons the texts do not make entirely clear, could no longer continue. Perhaps they died. Perhaps they left. Perhaps they simply diminished, their power fading as the world changed, until they could no longer sustain the presence they once had. The Anunnaki, in later periods, are described as withdrawn, as relegated to the underworld, as no longer active in human affairs. They are remembered, honored, invoked in ritual, but they do not appear. They do not intervene. The world belongs to humanity now, and humanity must manage it alone, guided only by the memory of what was taught, what was established in the time before the flood. There is a poem, Sumerian in origin, that survived into Babylonian copies and eventually into our own era. It is called the Lament for Sumer and Ur, and it describes the destruction of the Sumerian cities by invading forces around 2000 BCE. But the language it uses is the language of the flood. The cities are drowned, not in water but in violence and fire. Yet the imagery is the same. Everything swept away, the order collapsed, the people scattered. And the lament asks, over and over, why the gods allowed this. Why they did not protect what they had established. Why they stood silent while everything they had built was torn down. The answer, when it comes, is chilling in its simplicity. The gods decreed it. They made the decision, in council, that the time of these cities had ended, that the storm would come, and the cities would fall, and a new order would replace the old. It is the flood again, in different form, the same pattern. The same mechanism of destruction followed by rebuilding, of an old world ending and a new one beginning with only fragments of what came before. The Sumerians, writing this lament, understood that they were not the first to experience this, that their own civilization had been built on the ruins of something earlier, and that those ruins, in turn, might rest on older ruins still. They understood that time was deep, that history was layered, that what they thought of as the beginning was only the beginning they could see. Behind it, before it, there were other beginnings, other endings, stretching back into a past they could no longer access except through the distorted lens of myth and the fragmentary evidence of the earth itself. We find their tablets now, buried in the sand, and we read them with tools they could not have imagined. We trace their language, decode their mathematics, map their cities with technologies that would seem like magic to them. And yet, for all our advancement, we cannot answer the central question their records pose. Were they remembering something real? Was there a world before the flood? A civilization that rose and fell before Sumer, that left behind only echoes and ruins and the faint memory of knowledge that had once been whole? The geological record tells us that the end of the last ice age was catastrophic. Between roughly 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, the climate shifted violently. Glaciers that had covered half the northern hemisphere melted in pulses, releasing unimaginable volumes of water into the oceans. Sea levels rose by more than 120 meters. Coastlines that had been inhabited for millennia were drowned. River valleys were flooded. Entire landscapes were transformed. And this was not a single event. It happened in stages, over thousands of years, with periods of relative stability interrupted by sudden, devastating floods, as ice dams broke and lakes the size of seas emptied in days. If there had been cities along those ancient coastlines, and why would there not be? Given that coastlines are the most favorable environments for early settlement, they are gone now. Drowned beneath 100 meters of ocean, inaccessible to archaeology, invisible to us. If there had been civilizations in the fertile valleys that are now underwater, we would not know. We would have no evidence. We would see only the survivors, the ones who moved inland, who rebuilt in the highlands and the new river valleys that formed as the water found new paths. We would see only the after, and we would assume it was the beginning, because we would have no way to access the before. The Sumerians told us there was a before. They described it in detail: cities, kings, knowledge, order. They said it was destroyed by water. They said only a few survived, and that those survivors carried forward what they could, rebuilding in a world that had been made strange and hostile. And they said, repeatedly, that what came after was lesser than what had been, that they were living in a diminished age, an age of fragments, an age that had lost the wholeness and the presence of the time before the flood. We do not have to believe them literally. The numbers are impossible. The time spans are mythic. The gods, as literal beings, belong to a category we no longer accept. But we can believe that they were remembering, that somewhere in their collective memory, passed down through generations, there was the knowledge of an older world, a world that had ended, a world whose ending had been so total, so traumatic, that it became the central organizing event of their entire cosmology, the moment that divided all time, the catastrophe against which all other catastrophes were measured. And if that is true, then what we call Sumerian civilization may not be the beginning at all. It may be the recovery, the second attempt, the effort of survivors to recreate from memory and ruins what had been lost when the waters rose and the old world drowned. Continue. 1857. There are details in the Sumerian text that resist easy dismissal. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in its oldest versions, describes the hero traveling to meet Utnapishtim, the man who survived the flood. Utnapishtim lives, the text says, at the mouth of the rivers, in a place that is both of this world and beyond it. He has been granted immortality, not as a reward, but as a consequence. He is the last living witness to the antediluvian world, and he must endure because he carries knowledge that cannot be allowed to die completely. When Gilgamesh finally reaches him, after a journey that takes him beyond the known world, Utnapishtim tells him the story. He describes the decision of the gods, the warning from Enki, the construction of the vessel, but he also describes what came before. He speaks of a time when the world was young, when the gods labored alongside humanity, when the boundaries between the divine and the mortal were not fixed. He describes cities that stood for thousands of years, untroubled by war or famine, sustained by knowledge that flowed from the Absu, from the deep waters where Enki dwelt. He describes a stability that is almost incomprehensible to us, a civilization that did not rise and fall in the usual pattern, but that endured, unchanging, for so long that its endurance became part of the natural order. And then he describes how it ended, not gradually, not through decay, but suddenly. The decision was made. The flood was sent. And everything that had been was swept away in 7 days. Gilgamesh, listening to this, asks the question that we would ask. Why? Why destroy what had been so carefully built? Why end what had endured for so long? And Utnapishtim's answer is opaque. He says the gods regretted it afterward, that they had not anticipated how complete the destruction would be, how much would be lost, that they gathered around the sacrifice he made after the waters receded and wept for what they had done. But he does not say why the decision was made in the first place, only that it was made, and that it could not be undone, and that the world that came after was not the world that had been. This sense of rupture, of discontinuity, runs through all the Sumerian material. Their myths are not myths of origin in the way Greek or Norse myths are. They do not explain how the world came to be. They explain how the world came to be as it is now broken, difficult, mortal. They assume an earlier state, a better state, and they locate the transition at the flood. Before the flood, there was order. After the flood, there is struggle. And humanity, caught in the middle, must make do with fragments. The king list itself encodes this, too. The antediluvian section is brief, just 8 kings, ruling in 5 cities, across a span that the text renders as 241,200 years. Then a single line. The flood swept over. And then the list resumes, but everything has changed. The first king after the flood, ruling in the city of Kish, reigns for 1,200 years, still impossible by our standards, but a tiny fraction of what came before. The kings that follow have progressively shorter reigns, as if time itself is speeding up, as if the world is moving from a state of deep stability into something more volatile, more recognizably historical. By the time the list reaches the dynasties we can verify through other records, the reigns are measured in decades, like those of ordinary rulers. The mythic has given way to the historical, but the transition is gradual, and the text treats it as a single continuous chronology, not as a shift from fiction to fact. What if the numbers, impossible as they are, encode something real, not literal years, but something else dynasties, perhaps, or generations counted in a way we no longer understand? What if the antediluvian period represents not 8 individuals, but 8 long phases of stable rule, each lasting centuries, in a civilization that measured time differently than we do, that organized its chronology around cycles rather than linear progression? The Sumerians used a sexagesimal system, base 60, for their mathematics and their astronomy. They divided the day into 12 double hours, the year into 12 months, the zodiac into 12 signs. Their sense of time was cyclical, repetitive, returning always to the same points. Perhaps the antediluvian chronology reflects this, not a literal timeline, but a symbolic representation of an age that was measured in cycles, in the repetition of order, until the order broke and time became linear, became historical, became the time we recognize. This is speculation, but it is the kind of speculation the evidence demands if we take the Sumerian text seriously as memory rather than pure invention. And there are other texts, other fragments, that point in the same direction. The Sumerian flood story, known from a single damaged tablet found at Nippur, describes not just the flood but the world before it. It speaks of cities that were built according to divine plan, laid out with geometric precision, oriented to the stars. It describes a priesthood that maintained rituals of staggering complexity, rituals that regulated the flow of time, the cycles of the heavens, the relationship between earth and sky. It describes a society that was hierarchical but stable, where each person knew their place and their function, and where the knowledge required to maintain the whole was concentrated in the hands of a few who had been trained from childhood to carry it forward. And then the flood came, and that entire system collapsed. The priests were scattered, the temples were destroyed, the knowledge that had been concentrated was dispersed, and much of it was lost because there was no longer the infrastructure to teach it, to maintain it, to ensure its continuity. What survived was what could be carried in memory songs, formulas, techniques that were simple enough to be passed on without formal training. The rest disappeared. And the civilization that emerged afterward, Sumerian civilization, had to reconstruct what it could from what remained, building new institutions, new cities, new systems of knowledge, but always aware that what they had was incomplete, that there had been more, and that the more was gone. The ziggurats, in this context, take on a different meaning. They were not just temples, they were mnemonic devices. Each one was a physical embodiment of the cosmic order, a model of the universe as the Sumerians understood it. The earth platform, the ascending levels representing the heavens, the temple at the summit where the divine and human could meet. To build a ziggurat was to rebuild the cosmos in miniature, to reassert order against chaos, to demonstrate that the knowledge of how things should be arranged had not been entirely lost, and to rebuild them, generation after generation, on top of the ruins of earlier ziggurats, was to maintain continuity, to insist that the present was connected to the past, that the thread had not been completely severed, but the thread was fraying. The Sumerian language itself, by the 2nd millennium BCE, was becoming a dead language. It was still used in temples and schools, still copied and studied, but it was no longer spoken in the streets. Akkadian, a Semitic language, had replaced it as the common tongue. The cities that had been Sumerian were now Babylonian, and the Babylonians, though they revered Sumerian culture, though they preserved its texts and continued its traditions, were not the same people. The transfer was peaceful, gradual, but it was a transfer nonetheless. And with each transfer, Sumerian to Babylonian, Babylonian to Assyrian, Assyrian to Persian, something was lost. Texts were copied incorrectly. Meanings were forgotten. Rituals were simplified. The connection to the original source, to the antediluvian knowledge, became more and more attenuated. By the time the last cuneiform tablets were written, in the 1st century of our own era, the tradition was more than 3,000 years old. It had survived the fall of Sumer, the fall of Babylon, the fall of Assyria. It had survived conquest by the Persians, by Alexander, by the Seleucids, by the Parthians. But it did not survive Rome. The temples were closed. The schools were shuttered. The knowledge of how to read cuneiform died with the last generation of scribes. And for nearly 2,000 years, the tablets lay buried in the sand, mute, incomprehensible, until modern archaeology learned to read them again. What we have now is what survived that long silence, a fraction of what was written, a fragment of what was known. And yet, even in that fragment, the insistence remains. There was a world before this one. There were cities before these cities. There was knowledge before this knowledge, and it was lost. Not all at once, but gradually, through catastrophe and time, until only the memory remained. And then even the memory became myth. And then even the myth was forgotten, buried under the ruins of empires that rose and fell without ever knowing what lay beneath them. The Sumerians tried to prevent this. They wrote everything down. They created schools to train scribes. They built libraries to house the tablets. They established protocols for copying texts accurately, for preserving the exact wording of ancient formulas, for passing knowledge forward intact. They understood, in a way that we are only beginning to understand, that knowledge is fragile, that it can be lost, that without active, continuous effort to preserve it, it will slip away, and future generations will be left in ignorance, wondering what their ancestors knew, how they accomplished what they accomplished, what was lost when the old world ended. And still, despite all their efforts, most of it was lost. Most of what the Sumerians knew is gone. We have fragments. We have enough to glimpse the outline of their civilization, to admire its achievements, to recognize its sophistication. But we do not have the whole. We do not have the context that would make sense of the fragments. We are like the Sumerians themselves, standing in the ruins of something older, trying to piece together what it was, what it meant, how it worked. We are in the same position they were in, separated from a previous world by time and catastrophe, left with only echoes. The question that haunts the Sumerian record is not whether the antediluvian world existed exactly as described, but whether the pattern they perceived was real, whether there truly had been a cycle rise, stability, catastrophe, collapse, and whether they were correct in believing they lived in the recovery phase, not the origin. If they were correct, then we must consider the possibility that civilization is older than we think, not by centuries, but by millennia. That the neat timeline we have constructed agriculture beginning 10,000 years ago, cities 6,000 years ago, writing 5,000 years ago is incomplete. That it captures only the most recent iteration, the one that survived long enough to leave records we can read. There are places in the world where this possibility troubles the archaeology. Submerged ruins off the coast of India, structures that lie in water depths, suggesting they were built when sea levels were much lower, before the end of the Ice Age. Stone circles in Turkey and Lebanon that predate agriculture. Göbekli Tepe, already mentioned, with its impossible antiquity and its evidence of coordinated labor on a scale that should not have been possible for people without cities, without writing, without the apparatus we think civilization requires. And beneath the ocean, along the drowned coastlines of every continent, there are anomalies sonar readings that suggest geometric patterns, formations too regular to be natural, lying at depths that place them in the period when the ice was melting and the seas were rising. We do not investigate these thoroughly. The ocean floor is difficult to access, expensive to survey, and the presumption is that nothing of significance will be found because our models tell us no one was building cities 12,000 years ago. But the Sumerians did not have our models. They had their own records, their own traditions, and those records insisted that cities existed before the flood, that knowledge existed before Sumer, that the world they inhabited was a diminished remnant of something greater. Were they simply wrong? Or were they preserving a truth we have not yet rediscovered? Consider what the flood would have destroyed if it had been real. Not a single event, but the long process of sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, meters per century in some periods, enough to drown entire coastal plains within a few generations. If early civilizations had developed along those coasts, as logic suggests, they would have coastlines offer fish, trade routes, moderate climates, then those civilizations are gone, irretrievable. We would see only the survivors who moved inland, who adapted to new environments, who rebuilt in the highlands and river valleys. We would see the Bronze Age cities of Mesopotamia and Egypt and the Indus, and we would assume they were the beginning, because the earlier cities, if they existed, left no trace we can reach. The Sumerians, though, may have been close enough to the catastrophe to remember it. Not individually, the flood, in their chronology, happened long before Sumer arose, but collectively, through oral tradition, passed down across generations. And if that tradition began with survivors, with people who had actually experienced the drowning of their world, then the details might be more reliable than we assume. The 7 days and nights might be symbolic, but the core event, a great rising of waters that destroyed cities and forced populations to flee, might be literally true. The ice dam failures at the end of the Pleistocene released floods of staggering magnitude. The Black Sea flood hypothesis suggests that the Mediterranean breached the Bosphorus around 5,600 BCE, pouring into the Black Sea basin and raising its level by hundreds of feet, drowning vast areas of settled land. Events like this happened. The geological evidence is clear. The question is whether anyone remembered. The Sumerians remembered. Their entire civilization was organized around the memory. The flood was not a minor mythological detail. It was the central event, the pivot point, the moment that explained why the world was as it was. Every king list, every creation myth, every temple ritual referenced it. The gods themselves were shaped by it, their decision to send the flood, their regret afterward, their withdrawal from direct involvement in human affairs. The whole cosmology revolved around the understanding that there had been a break, a discontinuity, and that what came after was different from, and lesser than, what came before. And perhaps this is why the Sumerians were so obsessed with preservation, why they wrote everything down, why they built in stone when they could, why they buried foundation deposits and cylinder seals and tablets describing their works in the walls of their buildings. They were trying to ensure that if catastrophe came again, and they seemed to have expected that something would survive, some record, some message to whoever came after. They knew, from their own traditions, how completely a world could be erased. They knew that even great knowledge, even sophisticated civilization, could be reduced to fragments, and those fragments to myths, and those myths to vague unease, a sense that something important had been lost, but no memory of what it was. We are the ones who came after. Not immediately after, thousands of years after, an immense gulf of time across which almost nothing survived intact. We have their tablets because clay, once baked, is nearly indestructible. But how much did they write on papyrus, on leather, on wood? How much was painted on walls that have eroded away, sung in songs that were never written down, encoded in practices that ended when the last practitioner died? We have a fraction. And from that fraction, we are trying to reconstruct not just what the Sumerians knew, but what they thought they knew, what they believed they had inherited, what they were trying to preserve, The deepest Sumerian texts, the ones that deal with the time before the flood, have a particular quality. They are not narrative in the way later myths are narrative. They are more like inventories. Lists of kings, lists of cities, lists of the Mez, lists of the Anunnaki and their functions. It is as if the scribes were trying to catalog what remained, to count what had been saved, to make sure that the knowledge of what existed before was not lost, even if the things themselves were gone. This is the behavior of survivors, of people who have experienced loss and are desperately trying to hold on to whatever can be held. And what they held on to, above all, was the idea of order. The Sumerian word is me, but it means more than just law or decree. It means the fundamental pattern, the right way things should be arranged. The cosmos had me. Society had me. Each city, each temple, each craft and art and profession had its own me, and these were not invented by humans. They were revealed, taught, handed down from the time before, from the age when the Anunnaki walked among men and organized the world according to principles that transcended human understanding. To maintain me was to keep the world functional, to prevent the return of chaos. To lose me was to invite catastrophe. This is a profoundly conservative worldview, but it is also a profoundly anxious one. The Sumerians did not believe in progress. They believed in maintenance. They believed that the best they could do was to preserve what had been given, to prevent further loss, to hold the line against entropy and forgetting. And this belief makes sense only if there had actually been a great loss, a golden age that had ended, a time when things were better and knowledge was fuller and the world was ordered in a way that it no longer was. They were not looking forward to a better future. They were looking backward to a better past, trying to keep as much of it alive as they could. The Anunnaki, in this framework, were not gods in the sense of eternal, unchanging beings. They were the custodians of me, the ones who had held and transmitted the patterns, and they were gone, withdrawn to the underworld, to the edges of the cosmos, no longer present in the world of humans. But the me remained. Fragmented, scattered, held in different cities, guarded by different priesthoods, but still present, still accessible, still functional, if only partially. The task of Sumerian civilization was to keep them functional, to prevent further fragmentation, to ensure that what had survived the flood would not be lost to time. But it was being lost. Even as the Sumerians wrote, even as they built, they could feel it slipping away. The language itself was dying. The old rituals were becoming incomprehensible. The reasons for certain practices were forgotten, though the practices continued out of tradition. By the time Babylon succeeded Sumer, much had already been lost. The Babylonians revered Sumerian culture, studied its texts, continued its traditions, but they were inheritors, not originators. They did not fully understand what they had received. They preserved it as sacred, as ancient, as important, but the living connection was gone. And this is the pattern the Sumerians had warned against, the pattern they saw in their own history, in the gap between the antediluvian world and their own. Knowledge erodes, traditions simplify, meanings are lost while forms persist, and eventually, after enough time, all that remains is the awareness that something important once existed, coupled with the inability to say what it was. The Sumerians stood on one side of that gap, looking back at the antediluvian world. We stand on the other side of a different gap, looking back at them, and we find, in their records, the same frustration they must have felt, the sense of seeing something important through a glass darkly, of knowing it matters but not being able to fully grasp what it meant. There is a particular text, damaged and difficult to interpret, that was copied in the library of Ashurbanipal, but clearly derives from much older Sumerian sources. It describes the journey of Enki through the world, setting each thing in its proper place, but the language used is strange. He does not create, he recognizes. He does not invent, he remembers, as if the order he is establishing already existed in some prior form, and his work is to restore it, to bring the world back into alignment with a pattern that predates even the gods themselves. This is cosmology as archaeology. The divine work is not making something new, but recovering something old, something that was lost when the flood came and the previous world was swept away. If we take this seriously, and the Sumerians clearly did, then we must consider what kind of knowledge could have been lost. Not primitive knowledge, not the simple techniques of early agriculture or basic metalworking. Those would have survived easily, passed from parent to child, teacher to student, maintained through practice even if the reasons were forgotten. What would have been lost is the sophisticated knowledge, the systematic knowledge, the kind that requires institutions to maintain it, astronomical observations accumulated over centuries, mathematical systems developed through generations of refinement, engineering principles tested and perfected through countless iterations, medical understanding built on careful observation of thousands of cases. This is the knowledge that disappears when the institutions that house it collapse, when the schools close, when the libraries burn, when the priesthoods scatter. This knowledge vanishes in a single generation. The Sumerians had such knowledge. Their astronomy was precise enough to predict planetary movements. Their mathematics could solve complex problems involving geometry and algebra. Their medicine included surgical procedures and pharmaceutical compounds that required detailed understanding of anatomy and chemistry. Where did this come from? The standard answer is that they developed it themselves, gradually, over the centuries of Sumerian civilization. But their own texts say otherwise. They say it was taught to them, given to them, revealed by Enki, by the Anunnaki, by beings from the time before who possessed this knowledge already and transmitted it to the survivors of the flood. We can dismiss this as myth. We can say that every civilization credits its knowledge to divine revelation because ancient peoples did not understand the incremental nature of human progress. But there is another possibility, that the Sumerians were being literal, that there were teachers, not gods, but people, a previous civilization with accumulated knowledge, facing catastrophe, trying to ensure that what they knew would not be entirely lost, and so they taught. They passed on what they could to whoever would learn, to whoever survived, even knowing that much would be lost in the transmission, that the full context and the deep understanding would vanish, and only the bare techniques would remain. This would explain the anomalies, the sudden appearance of writing, fully formed, with no clear developmental period, the immediate sophistication of Sumerian mathematics and astronomy, the confidence with which they built their irrigation systems, as if they already knew the principles, already understood the hydrology, already possessed the engineering knowledge necessary to manage a river system as complex and dangerous as the Tigris-Euphrates. It would explain why they insisted they were not the first, why they built on top of older ruins, why they described their knowledge as inherited rather than invented. And it would explain the character of their relationship with the Anunnaki. These were not gods to be worshipped in the way later religions understood worship. They were teachers to be remembered, ancestors to be honored, sources of knowledge to be revered, because the knowledge itself was precious. The rituals performed in the temples were not prayers for intervention. They were acts of commemoration, of gratitude, of commitment to maintaining what had been given. The gods did not demand worship, they demanded preservation. They demanded that humanity continue the work, maintain the order, keep the me alive. And in return, humanity received the knowledge necessary to survive in a world that had become hostile, to rebuild in the ruins of what had been destroyed. But the knowledge degraded. Even with the best efforts, even with the most careful copying, errors crept in. Meanings shifted. Context was lost. By the time the Babylonians were studying Sumerian texts, they were already struggling to understand them. The language was archaic. The references were obscure. The practices described no longer matched contemporary practice. They preserved the texts because they believed them to be sacred, to contain important truths, but they could not always extract those truths. The meaning was locked in a past they could no longer fully access. This is what forgetting looks like over long time scales. Not sudden amnesia, but gradual erosion. Each generation understands slightly less than the one before. Each copy introduces small errors. Each transmission loses nuance. And after enough generations, the original meaning is gone. And all that remains is the reverence for the text itself, the belief that it contains something important, even if no one can quite say what. The Sumerians feared this. They feared becoming to their descendants what the antediluvian world was to them, a lost source, remembered imperfectly, understood poorly, preserved only in fragments. And they were right to fear it. It happened exactly as they worried it would. The language died, the traditions ended, the knowledge scattered. And for 2 millennia, their texts lay unread, their cities buried, their civilization forgotten, except as vague references in biblical texts and classical sources that got most of the details wrong. When cuneiform was finally deciphered in the 19th century, when the tablets were translated and the Sumerian king list was read again after thousands of years of silence, scholars did not know what to make of it. The antediluvian kings with their impossible reigns were dismissed as mythology. The flood was explained away as a local inundation. The Anunnaki were categorized as typical ancient gods, no different from the pantheons of Greece or Rome. The texts were mined for historical information, the later dynasties, the ones that matched other records, and the rest was set aside as religious fancy. But the Sumerians themselves made no such distinction. They presented it as a continuous chronology. Before the flood, these kings in these cities. After the flood, these kings in these cities. All part of the same timeline, the same history, recorded with the same care and the same confidence. If the later entries are historical, and we know they are, why should we assume the earlier ones are not? Because the numbers are impossible? The numbers may be wrong, corrupted through copying, misunderstood in translation from an older system we no longer possess. But wrong numbers do not mean false events. A distorted memory is still a memory. The flood traditions exist in cultures that had no contact with Sumer, could not have borrowed the story from Sumerian sources. The indigenous peoples of the Americas tell of a great deluge. Australian Aboriginal traditions describe the rising of the seas, the drowning of the coastal lands where their ancestors lived. Stories from Southeast Asia, from the Pacific Islands, from Africa, all describe water coming, the old world ending, a few surviving to rebuild. These cannot all be independent inventions. They are too similar in their essential details. The warning, the vessel, the rising water, the destruction of the world that was, the emergence into a world that is different. If the flood was real, and geologically we know it was, We know the seas rose catastrophically at the end of the Ice Age. Then the memories are real. Different cultures remembered it differently, encoded it in different symbolic systems, attached different meanings to it. But they all remembered, and they all placed it at the boundary between ages. Before the flood, one kind of world. After the flood, another. The world we live in now, the world of recorded history, of cities and agriculture and writing, is the after. The before is lost to us, accessible only through the distorted lens of myth and the fragmentary evidence of ruins that are so old we can barely date them, let alone understand them. The Sumerians were closer to the boundary. They emerged into the after early enough that the memory of the before was still strong, still detailed, still insisted upon as fact rather than fable. They recorded what they remembered. They built their civilization on the foundation of that memory, trying to recreate what had been lost, trying to maintain the patterns that had been revealed to them, trying to ensure that the knowledge would not die again as it had died in the flood. And they failed. Not immediately, not completely, but eventually. The continuity they fought to maintain was broken. The knowledge was lost. The language died. The texts were buried. For thousands of years, no one could read what they had written. No one knew what they had known. The ziggurats eroded into shapeless mounds. The canals silted up. The cities became desert. And the memory of Sumer itself faded into legend, distorted beyond recognition, until modern archaeology dug into the sand and found the tablets and realized that this was not legend at all, but history. That these people had actually existed. That they had built great cities, developed sophisticated knowledge, recorded their thoughts and beliefs with care and precision. That they were real. And if the Sumerians were real, and their records describe an antediluvian world with the same care and precision they used to describe their own dynasties, then perhaps that world was real too. Not exactly as described, distorted by time, by translation, by the limitations of human memory across vast spans, but real nonetheless. A civilization that rose before Sumer, that developed knowledge, that faced catastrophe, and that left behind only fragments, ruins beneath the ocean, survivors who carried stories forward, techniques that were passed down without their full context, a memory that grew dimmer with each generation until it became myth, and myth faded into silence. The silence that follows the end of a civilization is not empty. It is full of whispers, faint impressions left in stone, in clay, in the shape of the land itself. The Sumerians heard those whispers. They listened to what the ruins told them, to what the old stories carried forward, and they wrote it down. Not as fantasy, not as entertainment, but as memory, as testimony to a world that had ended, that had left only echoes. We stand now at an even greater distance. The Sumerians themselves are ruins to us, their language dead, their cities buried, their knowledge scattered across museums and universities, fragments pieced together by scholars who can read the words but cannot hear the voices. And yet, through those fragments, the message still comes. There was a world before this one. There were people who knew things we have forgotten. There was a catastrophe that erased nearly everything, and what we call the beginning of civilization may only be the beginning of what survived. Perhaps the Anunnaki were never gods at all. Perhaps they were simply the ones who came before a people who built in places now drowned, who organized knowledge in ways now lost, who faced the rising waters and knew their world was ending. Perhaps some of them survived long enough to teach, to pass on what they could to those who would rebuild. And perhaps, across the generations, as memory faded and context disappeared, they became something else in the telling. became teachers who seemed like gods, became distant figures who had once walked among humanity but now were gone. The truth, if there is truth beneath the myth, may be simpler and sadder than the stories suggest. Not divine intervention, but human continuity. Not magic, but memory. Not eternal beings, but mortal people, trying desperately to ensure that what they knew would not die with them when the waters came. They failed, mostly. Most of it was lost, but not everything. The fragments reached the Sumerians. The Sumerians preserved them. And now, thousands of years later, we read those fragments and wonder. What we are left with is the pattern: rise, stability, catastrophe, collapse, survival, rebuilding. The Sumerians saw this pattern in their own past. We see it in theirs. And perhaps it extends further back than either of us can see, cycle after cycle, civilization after civilization, each one building on the ruins of what came before, each one believing itself to be the first, the origin, until it too falls and becomes the ruins upon which the next will build. The Sumerians tried to break the cycle. They tried to preserve, to maintain, to hold the line against forgetting. They wrote everything down. They built in stone. They encoded their knowledge in rituals that would be repeated long after the meaning was lost, hoping that someday someone would remember. And in a sense, they succeeded. We remember them. We read their words. We walk among their ruins. But we do not fully understand. We stand where they stood, looking back into deep time, seeing dimly what they saw, wondering what was lost. Perhaps that is all we can do. Perhaps the past is always like this, visible but unreachable, present but incomprehensible, whispering truths we can almost hear but never quite grasp. The Sumerians believed there had been a golden age, a time before the flood when knowledge was whole and the world was ordered and the gods walked among men. We do not know if they were right. We know only that they believed it, and that their belief shaped everything they built, everything they wrote, everything they tried to preserve for us. And so we are left in the quiet, in the space between what was remembered and what was forgotten, listening to echoes that grow fainter with each passing century, wondering what else has been lost, what other worlds lie buried beneath the sand and the sea, waiting for someone to remember. The tablets are silent now. The cities are dust. The rivers have changed their courses. But the memory remains, carried forward through time, fragile and distorted but still present, still insisting, still whispering that there was more, that we are standing in the ruins of something greater, that the beginning we think we know is not the beginning at all. And perhaps, in the end, that is enough to know that we do not know, to understand that time is deeper than we thought, that human story longer and stranger than our textbooks allow, to stand in the presence of mystery and let it remain mysterious, rather than explaining it away, dismissing it, forcing it into categories that make us comfortable but may not be true. The Sumerians looked back across the flood and saw a lost world. We look back across the millennia and see them, and through them, dimly, the world they remembered. And both of us, ancient and modern, separated by all of history, both of us are doing the same thing, trying to remember, trying to piece together what was broken, trying to hear, across the vast silence, what the dead are trying to tell us. The story does not end. It only fades, like a voice calling from a great distance, growing quieter, harder to make out, until finally there is only the wind moving across empty sand, carrying something we can no longer name.